Joy, Shannon, my take is if this is true, the nightmare continues in Cleveland, Ohio.
Absolutely.
I feel so sorry for the dog pound next year if this is true. Because to me, reportedly, the Browns are trying to decide between two potential first overall pick busts. Look, we talked about Myles Garrett. He had 12 sacks in 21 SEC games, and you and I have talked about how most of his big sack games came against Louisiana Monroe and Lamar and Rice and UT San Antonio. I'm sorry, I watch so many college games, and he never leaped off my screen.
Mm-hmm.
I watched a good number of North Carolina games also. Mitch Trubisky never jumped off my screen. I've been shocked that he's risen up the board so quickly, and now he's a candidate to be the #1 overall pick. So let's get this straight. He redshirted when he was a freshman at North Carolina. He failed to win the job as a sophomore and as a junior. Marquise Williams started.
Yeah.
Marquise, again, maybe not made for pro football, but he was on the practice squad at Green Bay and Minnesota last year briefly, and now he doesn't have a current team. So really, that's your guy. And so he started 1 year for North Carolina. He had a big year statistically, 30 touchdowns to 6 interceptions, but the team went 8-5, including the Sun Bowl loss to Stanford, in which he threw 2 touchdowns to 2 interceptions. And I watched a good bit of that game, and I just didn't see it. I'm sorry. I don't get it. And yet, remember, this is smoke screen time pre-draft in the National Football League. So I'm hoping for Browns fans' sake that this is just a smoke screen, that they're trying to entice somebody to come up and trade for the #1 overall pick to take either Myles Garrett or Mitchell Trubisky. I don't know if that's true because, look, I know Paul DePodesta, who's their sort of the brains of the operation because he's the stats guy.
Right.
And he's a smart guy. I don't know Sashi Brown, but everybody tells me he's a dynamo. And I do know Hugh Jackson, and I love him, and I respect him.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure where does the buck stop here? Who has the final say? Is it a
Jimmy
third?
Haslam.
Maybe. You could. It was on Manziel,
Yep.
Jimmy Haslam. But in this case, I'm hoping that they have more brains than those two guys because I would take Deshaun Watson #1 overall, and I wouldn't look back. I'd be fine with that. But if you're going to take a defensive player, would I take Myles Garrett maybe 10th overall, where I could sort of reduce my risk on him a little bit? Yeah, I might. But, man, I like Malik Hooker a lot. Every time I watch Malik Hooker in Ohio State, he leaped off my screen.
Yeah.
He plays safety.
Yeah.
Can't rush the passer. I guess he could blitz. But, he's not that guy.
Right.
Not a dominating pass rusher. But if you want the best defensive player, he's the best one available to my eye.
Skip, for me, if this were a John Elway in the draft, John Elway, no matter who the other, say Bruce Smith, John Elway, or whomever, receiver, running back, whoever it is, John Elway's going first. Because you're going to take the quarterback because he's the guy that can score the points.
Yeah,
and if you have that guy, you can build from there. Skip, there's no quarterback in this draft like of that cloth. So now, you would have thought they've watched every single game that Myles Garrett has played in, freshman all the way to junior. They watched every game that Trubisky has played in. He goes to the combine. You watch their pro days. Skip, you should be at a consensus now. This is where we're going.
Yep.
But knowing Cleveland, they're going to take a punter. They're going to say, man, the wind be blowing off this lake, so we need to pin somebody down deep, so let's go ahead and take the punter with the first overall pick. They're going to mess this up, Skip. This is ridiculous. Whomever has the final say, if your gut says take Myles Garrett, take him. If your gut says take Trubisky, take him. Because if you acquiesce and you let the majority rule, you're going to have resentment if this guy doesn't pan out. And that's normally how it works, Skip. Now, I thought they said Hugh Jackson would have final say on the rock. If I'm Hugh, I believe Garrett is the guy, I'm going with Garrett. I understand. But what you do is that when you need a quarterback and you reach Akili Smith, you reach Jake Locker, you reach Blaine Gabbert, Skip, that sets you back even further. I just don't, I don't get it. I don't get it. And like I said, and there's really no player in this draft, even any draft, that has, every player has warts. There's something that he doesn't do particularly well.
This draft is deep to me, and guys who can play, but there's no John Elway.
Right, right. And the thing is with Garrett, like I said, he doesn't always play to the measurables. To be 6'4", 272, can run like he can run, can jump, almost 500-pound bencher, Skip, he should be ripping people's heads off. But you don't see that game in and game out. And that's the concern I have with him. But Trubisky, and I know they say, well, Cam Newton jumped off the screen. You knew Cam Newton was special. And think about it. Cam Newton won a national championship. Is there anybody on that roster, on the offensive side of football, that's in the NFL other than Cam? No. That just goes to show you how special he was. He did that in the toughest conference. He was down, what was it, 21-7, 21-0 to Alabama?
He was.
And brought him back?
He did.
So, do I think Mitchell Trubisky is going to be Cam Newton?
By the way, Cam won a national championship at Blinn Junior College, and he won one at Auburn. So,
and he validated Carolina's taking him first overall by winning an MVP and taking him to the Super Bowl. Skip, I just don't see the love. Like I said, I don't watch all the game tape like these evaluators do of Mitchell Trubisky, but just looking at him on television, Skip, I don't see what the love and the infatuation is about this young man.
So, again, I know these guys, and individually, like Paul DePodesta, you probably don't know him, but he was out of the Oakland A's. He's a baseball guy, and he's a
like Moneyball?
Yeah, he's a Moneyball guy. Came from Billy Bean's family tree, sort of. And he knows his stats. He played football at Harvard. I don't know just Harvard, but he was a pretty good football player at Harvard. So he gets football. But I don't think you can apply the numbers to football that you can apply to gauge and predict success in baseball.
Correct.
Because the only number I know in football for quarterbacks is my favorite one, QBR. And last year, despite 30 touchdowns and 6 interceptions, Trubisky had the 10th best QBR in America. So that's not great. It's not saying John Elway, Dan Marino, whoever. It's not predicting greatness to me.
And you look at Deshaun Watson, though, Skip, his body of work, he was a 3-year starter. Now, the expectations of this young man coming into Clemson, he was highly touted. He was the #1 quarterback coming out. And for him to not only meet those expectations, he exceeded them. He was supposed to win the Heisman. Now, he didn't win the Heisman, but he was in New York both of his last 2 years, sophomore and junior year. He was supposed to win a national championship. He lost it as a sophomore. He came back and won it as a junior. So you look at his body of work, you look at his resume, you're like, okay, on the biggest stage, when they needed to make a throw, or they needed a drive, or they needed a play to be made with his legs, he did it.
Yeah, biggest stage versus the best defense, right?
Yeah.
And he did it twice. He barely lost one game, and he barely won the next game against Alabama.
If I'm wrong about Trubisky, I'll be the first to come up here and say it. But, Skip, I do not see what everybody else see in this young man.
I don't either, and I pity Cleveland if they're stuck with Mitchell Trubisky going forward. Because especially if you take him #1 overall and then you heap the pressure and expectation on him and he can't live up. Ugh.
Yeah. Then where do you go? But then where do you go, Skip? Because you're stuck with him for – if you take a quarterback in the first round, Skip, you stuck with it for at least 2 to 3 years.
You are.
So then what? You losing. You still losing. At some point in time, the Cleveland – and I give the Cleveland Browns fans a lot of credit. They haven't been good for a very, very long time. But you know what, Skip? They show up every Sunday. They tailgate. I mean, they start tailgating at 6 a.m. And by the time kickoff at 1, they're ready to go. When more times than not, they already know the outcome of the ball game is going to be.
I agree.
You know, my Pittsburgh blood prevents me from having pity on any Cleveland team, but I do have respect for Browns fans because they've been through it. They have 10 different starters over the last 4 seasons, so they've got 2 weeks to decide what they're going to do with it and get it right. We'll see.
Brought to you by Straight Talk Wireless.